One November evening in 2009, John Edward Jones, together with his close ones, went into the Nutty Putty caves located near Salt Lake City in Utah. The group decided to go on a short journey before Thanksgiving. Who could have thought that a simple holiday trip would turn out to be a real tragedy? The Nutty Putty caves got their name for the soft brown clay they are made of. Found in 1960, this natural phenomenon was divided into lots of little caves connected by narrow and low passages. Despite the seemingly challenging route due to the tight corridors, the caves were perfect for newbies to caving. That's why tons of tourists tried their luck there every year. There were many cool attractions for them to enjoy, like that room with a floor inclined at 45 degrees, or the labyrinth of tiny passages. Though, it's not like the caves were completely trouble-free, as there were some cases of people getting stuck in those narrow parts of the cave. It all resulted in the caves closing down for a couple of years and then reopening again. This time, with a sign-in system and online reservation, making it easy for the staff to know for sure who was in the caves so that they were not overcrowded. And that's when John Edward Jones visited the Nutty Putty caves on November 24th. He and his brother Josh were, in fact, amateur cavers, as both of them went on many underground adventures when they were kids. But they'd never tried the Nutty Putty caves before. The group entered the caves, which was going pretty well initially. They crawled and squeezed themselves through the tunnels, observing everything with awe. There was also that thingy called the birth canal, famous for its narrowness and stiffness. It was at about 9 p.m. when John discovered it, or at least that's what he thought. The tunnel where he scrambled inside was definitely very tight and suffocating, but the birth canal was monitored and easily navigated, so he was sure he would be fine. That's why when the tunnel took a downward turn, he didn't have even an ounce of doubt and went straight for it. He was sure the tiny passage would open up further down. That's how the caves were built, right? It turned out that John wasn't in the birth canal. In fact, he was squeezing himself through an unregistered passageway. That part of the caves was never registered because it was considered too small for anyone to get in there. So, people just assumed that no one would even try. Oblivious to a looming danger, John wriggled himself further down until he got stuck upside down in a nearly vertical tunnel. The diameter smaller than that of a front-loading washing machine. As John's brother Josh was right behind him, he quickly discovered that he couldn't move. First, he tried pulling John out, but only succeeded in shifting him a bit. So, Josh rushed for help while another friend stayed with John. The rescuers managed to arrive within hours, and straight away got down to a pretty labor-intensive evacuation. It was midnight and dark, both outside and inside the caves. Besides, the tunnel John was stuck in was so tight that only one person could reach him at a time. That was a difficult task indeed. John tried to keep his cool. When the first rescuer got to him, he thanked them and told them he really wanted to get out. First, the rescuers tried carefully destroying the rocks around John to make the tunnel slightly wider. But they didn't get far with that, even after hours of drilling. Then they decided to start pulling him out, with ropes turned around his legs. That was the only part they could find. For a moment, it even looked like they got him. The rescue team managed to haul him out enough to believe in the success of the operation, though it definitely was a painful procedure for John. While they had a small rest, They lowered down a radio to John so that he could have a word with his pregnant wife waiting for him outside. At that point, he was stuck there for 19 hours. Basically, a day spent head down in a suffocating tunnel. For a note, being upside down for so long isn't just an inconvenience. It leads to blood going straight into the head, which in turn can result in a vessel rupture or even blindness. To make matters worse, it's rather hard to breathe, as all the organs press the lungs. For some people, even 10 minutes upside down can be lethal. Though John had been in that position for a day, he remained as calm as possible. He could even see one of his rescuers after a few more pulls. When they asked him how he felt, tired and in pain, he only uttered, "It sucks. I'm upside down. I can't believe I'm upside down. My legs are killing me." The rescue team had made so much progress that it seemed the escape was pretty close. Somewhat higher above him, there were his friends and family together with healthcare workers waiting for him outside. The rescuers only had to pull a little further. That's when everything went downhill. As they tugged once more, a rock, around which the rope had been bound, suddenly crashed. Because of that, one of the bolts fell off, making the rope looser. The rescuer next to John was hit unconscious by the stone, while John collapsed back down the tunnel. When the rescuer came to, it was all pitch black, and John was nowhere to be seen. The rescue team evacuated the injured worker, allowing another rescuer to step in. They spoke to John, but he didn't reply, only breathing heavily somewhere down there. They tried to reach him and bind his legs one more time, but got stuck in the process and had to be evacuated as well. Then, a doctor was brought down the tunnel to examine John as much as possible. But what was found was their worst fear. John had died. Those waiting for him outside were overwhelmed by the news. That is understandable. The man was just 26 years old, happy and healthy. To die in the caves considered beginner-friendly is insane. The rescue team decided against getting John's body out of the caves, as the evacuation would be too hazardous, if not impossible. The landowner was so shocked by the tragedy that he wanted to blow up the caves and demolish them. However, he was persuaded otherwise. The caves were fully closed and turned into a tomb for John Edward Jones, an amateur caver who lost his life in such an unusual and tragic event. There was also a sign set up just at the entryway to pay respect to the man resting in those sealed caves. This story started on Vancouver Island when 6 men decided to go on a terrifying exploration of the Cascade Cave, which is actually 300 feet or 91 meters deep. Vancouver Island is the biggest and most densely populated island on the west coast of the Americas. Vancouver Island's climate is also variable. Its temperatures are the warmest in all of Canada. The island is up to 262 inches or 665 centimeters, the largest in North America. At the same time, the eastern end and the rain shadow of the mountains can only be seen at 24 inches or 61 centimeters. Besides, most of the rain and snowfall is in the winter. On a fateful day on December 5th, 2015, at 6 a.m., Jason leaned over his bed to kiss his wife Caroline goodbye. That was the day he and his 5 friends were going 80 miles, or 129 kilometers, northwest of his home in the town of Duncan on Vancouver Island to visit the cave. As he left the house, it was still raining, as it usually does during winter in the Pacific Northwest. But Jason was prepared. He had some neoprene socks, rubber boots, overalls, and a water-resistant jacket. He knew he could get wet not only during the trip, but also during the cave exploration, That's why he also brought a new helmet with a headlamp just for this caving. Jason wasn't a very experienced caver. This was going to be only his 5th time, and he realized that this was to be the most challenging cave he had gone to yet. The cave is known as Cascade Cave, close to the town of Port Alberni. This cave is quite dangerous, so going there is a big deal. To get into the cave, you must get a key that opens the hatch at the entrance. To get this key, a group of cavers must sign a waiver that says they know and accept all the dangers of entering the cave system. What's more, the location of this cave can be considered a little bit of a secret in the community, so that inexperienced cavers can't go and hurt themselves, as well as ruin the system's formation. So, after Jason left the house, he went to meet a part of the group, paramedics Andrew and Adam, together with Zach, a cook and volunteer firefighter. Then, 4 of them drove to Port Alberni to get the key for a hatch, where they met the rest of the group. Matt and Taylor, working in tech at the time. 43-year-old Jason was older than others by about 10 years. He also had the least experience among the group. The one who made him interested in caving was his friend Andrew, who was perfect for the role of an instructor. He was both an experienced caver and an ex-cave guide. He was also blessed with a perfect wiry body type, which made caving even more accessible for him. Additionally, he was a paramedic, so in dangerous situations, he was invaluable. From Port Alberni, they boarded a forgotten train, went almost a mile, and then parked in a small clean field. There, they started to check their equipment: ropes, harnesses, and carabiners. That time, they even took a small ladder they wanted to use to go down through the cave's opening. They came rather prepared and brought some food, water, and a small portable gas oven. They even took a mylar blanket, which looked like it was made of aluminum foil and was terrific at keeping heat. When they finished, they started to go deep into the forest to find an opening to Cascade Cave. It's pretty easy to miss it, even by following a path to it, as it's covered with a not-so-big steel hatch. By the time they got there, it was already 10 a.m. Once they opened the lock on the hatch, they secured their ladder and tied ropes to their harnesses to go down, one by one. As the last person went down, he closed the hatch, leaving the place with no light. To open the door on their way back, they decided to tie the key to the bottom of the ladder to avoid losing their only way out. From the top, the cave goes down to 30 feet or 9 meters, right into the first chamber. They looked around and, using their headlamps, went into an abyss of darkness. Everything around them was wet and cold, and the temperature was slightly above the freezing point. But they knew what had been waiting for them, so thanks to their preparations, they could wiggle through a small, narrow passage away from the first chamber. This passage had rugged boulders and a ceiling that dripped wet from the moisture. As they went further, they noticed that all the water from the ceiling was starting to turn into a small rush. At first, it was really shallow up to the ankles, going a bit further up to the shins. After almost 45 minutes, Adam decided he wouldn't go further as his back injury was starting to make itself known, as they had to constantly bend over. He said goodbye to everyone and wished them good luck. So joined by Matt, he started his way back to the entrance. As soon as Adam left the cave, Matt locked the hatch again and returned to the others to continue the exploration. They crawled further and further through tight passageways for almost 2 hours. Even though they were constantly within about 100 feet from the first person to the last one, they couldn't see each other as the rocks were completely blocking the view. Jason felt wonderstruck with the cave. Everyone knows that there are over 1,000 unique caves on Vancouver Island. Finally, they came to a place that made this cave unique: Bastard's Crawl. This passage is so tight that you must slouch down to go through it. It also goes down, so cavers have to hold the ceiling to not slide down on the wet rocks. As they left Bastard's Crawl, they got to Double Trouble, the only big waterfall in the cave. It's called this because as the stream falls, at the top of the waterfall, it hits a rock that separates it into two. These streams go 50 feet, or 15 meters, down into a large chamber. At the top of the waterfall, the group installed rappel lines so that they could slowly go down the wet rocks into the dark abyss. They were trying to hold on as the water was splashing down everywhere. Going down, Jason's heart was beating faster and faster. As he loved challenges, he was getting exactly what he wanted. After a while, they finally got down. They decided to go away from the waterfall to take a break and have some lunch. That's when they paid attention to the fact that the water was going much faster and harder. After 3 hours in the cave, at about 1 p.m., they sat down to warm up some beef stew using their little oven. To them, that moment was perfect. Everything they wanted it to be, being 200 feet or 61 meters underground, only having some light from their headlamps. After about 20 minutes, they finished eating and decided to go further. They calculated that they would be at the end of the cave within an hour, with only a quarter mile, or about half a kilometer, left to go. At about 300 feet, or 91 meters from the place they ate, Zach began vigorously shaking. They spent 3 hours in the cave, so even the smallest break was enough for hypothermia to kick in. As they were almost at the end, they decided to go back and not leave Zach alone. As they went the same route back, getting to Double Trouble, they noticed that the streams were getting stronger. They also saw that the washed-down thick layer of mud was now sticking to their shoes. It was decided that the first one to go would be Matt, then Arthur, Jason, Zach, and the last one would be Andrew, as he had the most training out of the 6. Everyone knows climbing up is always much more complicated and slower than climbing down. And with water so strong, finding the safest place to set foot was even more complex. As Jason made it to Double Trouble, he thought of how the stream was getting so powerful and fast. He thought that somehow it might have been the rain that was adding so much water. To get out of Double Trouble, he started crawling up to Bastard's Crawl, as the water kept hitting him in the face. The water was so freezing cold that it seemed like it was only slightly above the freezing point. Going further, Jason got into another narrow tunnel that separated into 2 passageways. Not remembering which route to take and not seeing anyone ahead, he decided to go back down to ask. Descending back about 15 feet, or 4.5 meters, the water unexpectedly knocked Jason down. He hit his back, fully submerging under the water. As Jason tried to stand up, he understood that with water this strong, it was impossible. It was drawing him down. It was tough to keep his head above the water as the pressure around him kept growing. Jason understood that he had to act quickly so that the water pressure wouldn't launch his body through and over Double Trouble, which is about 50 feet or 15 meters down onto the rocks. He tried to move, but with the water being freezing cold and his boots stuck, he felt extremely cold and powerless. Jason understood that the only way out was to get help, but as he started screaming, the water got into his mouth, making him choke. After about 5 minutes with his family on his mind, he finally found the power to scream for help. Zach and Andrew managed to almost get to the place where Jason was. That's when they realized that Jason was in immense danger, and Andrew immediately ran over to him. As soon as he got there, barely seeing Jason's face in the water, he started screaming for him to keep his head up. He tried to get him out of the water, but with the stream being so strong, it was extremely hard to keep him on his legs. By that moment, Jason had almost no power left, so he couldn't really reach out to Andrew. Thus, Andrew decided to try to shout out to Jason what to do, helping him put his hands and feet in such a way that he could get himself out. As Jason almost got out, the water put him back in again, bringing him to square one. So they had to start everything again, with Andrew screaming to Jason what to do. Finally, Andrew could grab Jason and get him out of the torrent of water. With Jason's head completely out of the water, he could finally get some air. Although they were almost out, they still had a long way to go. Jason wanted to take a small break to catch his breath, but Andrew knew every second mattered, as the water flow was getting stronger and stronger. So he made Jason move, knowing they could get hypothermia any second. And finally, Jason managed to free his leg. Without stopping, they moved further into Bastard's Crawl. As soon as Jason was safe, Andrew asked Zach to stay with Jason as he went up to get their bags. After almost 20 minutes, he returned with a Mylar blanket, instantly putting it around Jason. He asked Zach to go back up and tell others about the situation, as the water level was rising and flowing much faster. He asked Zach to call the rescue team if Jason and he didn't catch up in the next 30 minutes. Andrew also knew that in case they couldn't get out, there was no way this place could hold 3 people. So, when Zach left, Andrew warmed up Jason in heated water to pour it on his clothes. Andrew couldn't check, but he was pretty sure that Jason had the second stage of hypothermia. All symptoms led him to believe it was true as Jason stopped shaking and his face lost all color. After a little while, thanks to a Mylar blanket and warm water, Jason finally started to get warmer. Now they could try getting out of the cave, which would normally take about an hour. Unfortunately, when they started going back up, the water was still rushing. Almost by the end of Bastard's Crawl, only 4 inches or 10 centimeters were left between the water and the ceiling. There was no way for them to crawl through and have their heads out of the water to breathe. There was no other way but to return and wait until the water went down, hoping it wouldn't flood the cave. As soon as they returned, they could find a 45-degree ledge with enough space for both of them. The stream came rushing through the cave, wetting the outer edge, so they had to move to another side. They tried to find the most comfortable position because they knew they would have to sit for a long time. Some subterranean caves may have microclimates. The water flow was so fast that there was actual wind near the ledge. Over time, the water rose only a few feet below the ledge. Time flew by quickly as they sat together under the blanket. It was already 6 p.m., and they were still 200 feet, or 61 meters below the surface. 3 hours had passed since Zach left, and they still had no idea whether he managed to get out. They kept thinking of all the possibilities. What if the cave was flooded entirely? Something happened to someone, or they couldn't get out? What if no one was coming to help? Luckily, others managed to get to the surface. By 9 p.m., they found an area where there was service and were able to call the rescue team. The rescue team arrived fast. They tried to go into the cave and get Andrew and Jason, but were unable to do so as the water level was way too high. They could only hope that both of them managed to find a safe place to wait until the water went down. Meanwhile, Jason and Andrew were sitting in the cave in complete darkness, wondering if help was coming. As hours went by, the water level was getting even higher. Both of them couldn't even sleep as the ledge was very steep, so if they fell asleep, they'd fall. That's why they had to check if the other was asleep every 20 minutes. Eventually, at about 5 a.m., it started to look like the water was going down. But they weren't too hopeful. They waited a bit more before trying to exit one more time. It was hard to move again as they had to sit in the same position for more than 12 hours. For about half an hour, they were desperately trying to get out. At first, they were crawling. Then they had to walk through the water that reached their chest. And finally, they sought the light from the entrance. They cried out, and one rescuer, relieved to see them, even called back, "I love you." After 24 hours in a cave, they finally got back up on the aluminum ladder. As a true Canadian, Andrew met them with cheers, finally getting out of the 30-foot or 9-meter shaft. After a year, on May 7th, the friends came back to Cascade Cave to get their equipment and try conquering the cave once again. Last year, the cave tried to take their lives, but this year, they made it to the bottom with no problems. Today, I'll tell you about a rookie who once went all by himself to the deepest cave on Earth. Needless to say that for Sergei Kozeev, it turned out to be a real tragedy, and a strange one for that matter. So, Abkhazia has 4 of the world's biggest caves. Among them, there is the so-called Veryovkina cave, a part of which was first found in 1968 and then once again in 2000 when the researchers discovered that it was indeed the world's deepest cave with 2,212 meters in depth. It's not really suitable for newbies as the cave is rather hard to reach, located at 2,285 meters above sea level. Besides, it's a very cold place, with 4 to 7 degrees Celsius and air humidity of 100. There are pretty narrow passages, underground rivers, and 15-meter mazes, some being a dead end while others fully flooded, so the trip might be extremely dangerous, like rocks suddenly falling on your head, or the water level rising and flooding the passageway you're going through. Just imagine, it takes about 8 days to reach the bottom and go back. Naturally, this cave is considered a challenge for all reckless adventurers, like 37-year-old Sergei Kozeev from Sochi, Russia. On November the 1st, 2020, he bid his wife and kids goodbye, got in his car, and drove away. Though his family didn't know that Sergei was actually going to tackle the Veryovkina cave in neighboring Abkhazia. The guy was in great shape because he enjoyed various sports, participating in marathons, practicing trekking, mountain climbing, and finally taking up caving as his new hobby. Despite his inexperience, Sergei thought it was a lovely idea to go through the Veryovkina cave alone, which, as we know, didn't end up well. First, he drove to Abkhazia, parked his car in a remote place, and climbed all the way to the cave. Without hesitation, he put his things into 3 transport bags, hung a rope, and went down the cave. It should be noted that in Veryovkina cave, there are 6 camps at different depths where you can eat and rest for a while. When Sergei passed the first tight and narrow 400 meters, he had his first stop at the camp. There he ate some pasta with ketchup and planned to go further to Camp 600. At the next camp, the man lived for a week eating cave-based products and pasta with ketchup. It seemed like he was actually having fun down there. Now it might sound bonkers, but just imagine. He continued going down the most challenging cave out there using only screenshots and a small printed map. At this depth, the cave is already very wet and cold, with water spilling on you, which means that if your equipment isn't suitable enough for the trip, you might die from hypothermia. So it was all fine for Sergei until he made it to 1,100 meters, or 11 football pitches if we're being real here, and it already sounds like an accomplishment. However, Sergei suddenly started having difficulties descending even further as the cold water constantly splashed on him, and he didn't even take his wetsuit. Picture this. You're in a very humid and cold place, continuously showered with freezing water. To make matters worse, his gear was totally unfit for the job. That's when the man started getting nervous. Tired from never-ending climbing and completely drenched, he decided to stop his journey and go back up to Camp 600. But he soon understood that his equipment couldn't help him ascend from that depth. Sergei tried countless times, yet he couldn't climb out without stirrups. It's hard to tell how long the man tried to ascend, but in the end, he gave up. He went to the base of the well he stuck in, lay there, and soon passed out, still fastened with his rope, all by himself in the most extensive cave on Earth. Unfortunately, he didn't manage to endure these harsh conditions and passed away from cold and exhaustion. After a couple of days, when Sergei didn't get back home like he often would on his solo trips, his wife reported him missing. However, no one could find the man. It seemed like he had just disappeared. He was considered missing for 9 months until, on August the 4th, 2021, a group of speleologists found a rope hanging at the entrance of the cave. It looked like someone was already in there. When they reached the first camp, they discovered a bag with moldy sneakers. Then, on their way down, the researchers noticed bits of equipment scattered around the cave. So they got really worried and thought somebody was stuck there. They went even further down to 1,100 meters when they finally found the body. It was a man curled up in a ball with his rope still attached to him. Evidently, he'd been lying there for quite some time, and his equipment wasn't suitable for that tricky cave. His gear was, in fact, some overalls with a pair of trekking boots without any stirrups, which are vital for a vertical cave like that. Next to him, they also found his bags, 2 phones, and a multi-tool. When they went through the photos on his phone, they discovered his 1-year plan to get to the deepest cave alone. Wild, but the man also didn't take any ID with him. They could identify him only thanks to Liza Alert, a search tool used for missing people. So that same day, they got in touch with his wife and identified him using photos on his phone. She asked his body to be removed from the cave, which was needed as the cave could really suffer from the decaying human corpse. Though the rescue team didn't know how they would do it because the cave was very tight and claustrophobic, so extracting the body on a stretcher was impossible. They called his wife once again, and a terrifying decision was made. They agreed on cutting Sergei up into pieces and evacuating him that way. That was a really gruesome task. It all began on August the 4th, when they started gathering donations from locals to pay for the extraction. And on August the 11th, a team of around 27 professional climbers was at the cave entrance, ready for the evacuation. They split into 2 groups and descended into the cave to get the body. On August the 13th, after 2 days of very difficult caving, they had to stop at one of the earlier camps they were in as the cave was flooded due to heavy rains. Then the group continued downward, spending the night at Camp 1000 and preparing themselves for the difficult task they had to complete. On August the 14th, they put on their wetsuits as they were going to go to a much wetter and more troublesome part of the cave. When they reached the body, they got down to work. The rescuers cut Sergei up into 10 pieces and packed him in 10 special heavy-duty bags. The group then spent the next few days extracting these bags out of the cave, which turned out to be very tough. Just imagine trying to get a heavy bag with a piece of the corpse in it through a very tight tunnel. Sounds like a nightmare. Finally, on August the 16th, both groups with all 10 bags reached the surface. The whole evacuation took 4 days in total. It was later found that Sergei should not have even been in the cave in the first place. He had gone there illegally. You see, it's necessary to be on a register to get in there, which was obviously not the case. That's why, by the way, nobody looked there for him to begin with. Of course the equipment was also deemed inadequate and totally unfit for that tricky cave, which was essentially the reason he died. Sergei was later buried by his family, which is quite sad if you think about it, as he left his wife and 2 children alone to explore the cave. His family was of course grateful to the rescue team who helped in that operation. I guess he was just too naive to go into that cave alone without telling a soul. Moreover, he didn't consider all the risks and didn't think about the right equipment. When I saw the video of them extracting those bags, it made me really sick and sad. And that was the story of an amateur who tried to tackle the deepest cave on Earth. Rest in peace, Sergei. Today, I'm going to tell you about the most tragic caving experience in Great Britain. So, fasten your seatbelts because we're coming to Yorkshire. Mossdale Caverns lie on the Yorkshire Dales, slopes in a wilderness area called Grassington Moor. The waters of Mossdale Beck disappear into the cave system at the foot of some limestone outcrops known as Mossdale Scars. That's where the large stream will flow underground for about 4 to 5 kilometers and won't resurface until Blackheld on the River Wharf. This constant flowing water has been changing the shape of the rock below for thousands of years. That's how it managed to create a narrow web of tunnels and caves. It's hard to imagine a more breathtaking view than that, right? Unfortunately, the caves below have a much different feeling. because of the fateful day of June 24th, 1967. Now it has a haunting and creepy reputation. That day, a group of 10 young men and women decided to explore the caverns. Early in the morning, they were already at the entrance. Among them were the 2 expedition leaders, Dave Adamson and Jeff Boireau. Their mission for the day was to go to the other end of the cave system and find new channels using blasting equipment. Dave Adamson and Jeff Boireau asked their friends John Ogden, Colin Vickers, Bill Frakes, and Michael Ryan to help them with the equipment, as it was too heavy. Whereas the other 4 members wanted to stay closer to the cave entrance and have a look at the wider cave. The group parted ways. It's hard to understand the path those 6 followed, especially for those who have never gone caving before. So, here is a short description of that cave web. At first, there are big caves like Boulder Hall, with comfortable tunnels where people can even stand. Then, there are ominous caves such as Drown or Glory, where the water is basically up to the neck. Some spaces are fully flooded, and it's even necessary to dive underwater to get through the hardest parts. But there's more to come. The second part of the exploration is even more terrifying. The tunnels are too low to stand up, so the only way to get further is to crawl. Due to the extreme difficulty, people believe it to be one of the most impossible caving tracks in the UK, and only a few really want to go there. It's easy to notice that the caves' names give hints about what is ahead for those willing to take up the challenge. At first, there is rough crawl that narrows into a tunnel known as Knee Wrecker. Then, there's this really tight corridor where the cavers have to wriggle their way through. It's known as Marathon Crawl. It consists of 2 parts, the Near Marathon Tunnel and the Far Marathon Tunnel, with each being about 900 feet long, which adds up to half a kilometer in total. However, there's still a small 5-foot cave between the tunnels that allows catching your breath a little. For those who have never experienced this type of adventure, it's hard to imagine what it's like to crawl so deep down below the surface. But those who dared to go to Mossdale Caverns admit that it's an indescribable feeling of constant pressure. You can't escape it. You have to fight for every centimeter as you go further. One minute, it can give you all the motivation you need. The other, it manifests all your deepest fears. As people go down Marathon Crawl full of water, they experience an overwhelming feeling of sickness and terror. But as soon as the cavers finish Far Marathon Tunnel, they sit there with mixed emotions as they've managed to survive this ordeal. But at the same time, they still have to go back the same way to reach the surface. That's where that day those 6 cavers were, crawling on their bellies with equipment behind them. Most of them must have been feeling uneasy, like all other cavers in such dangerous places, especially considering claustrophobic pressure and the constant risk of flooding that loom over them. By 5 p.m., the 4 that wanted to stay behind had finished exploring all the caves and tunnels, so they decided to go back to the cabin they rented. As it started raining, they got a bit worried. They knew that the other part of the group had to return at around 12. It's a well-known fact that in places like that, the weather can change the situation at any moment. Yet, they hoped it would be nothing serious, so they decided to go back. By around 7:30 p.m., it started literally showering, so Dave Adamson's fiancée, Morag Forbes, got very concerned and went back to see the cave entrance. There, she saw that everything was relatively fine, despite the heavy rain. Relieved, she was headed back to the cabin. But at 9 p.m., it only got worse. When Morag returned to the cave entrance shortly afterward, she saw a dreadful sight. The small stream had turned into a huge lake, with water flooding the entrance completely. Realizing straight away that the remaining cavers were in danger, she sprinted for more than 2 miles to get to the closest farmhouse and ask for help. By 11 p.m., the rescue team arrived at the scene. That's when they had to start a grueling mission, where their main goal was to redirect the water to ensure access to the cave system. The task was labor-intensive and demanded a lot of equipment. It took them the entire night to dig a trench and divert the water, so the entrance wasn't as flooded. Finally, as the morning rolled around, they could get into the caverns. That's where the rescuers could enter the cave system, hoping to find 6 lost men camping in one of the highest caves. The further they went, the more desperate they became, as they couldn't find anyone. So, rescuers decided to go down into the tough crawl and knee-wrecker tunnels. But again, nothing. Finally, they reached the notorious Marathon Tunnel, and when they began to wriggle themselves through that tight space, they saw something that left almost no hope. The bodies of Michael Ryan and Jeff Boireau were squeezed together on one side of the tunnel. There, they probably were desperately trying to get some air. After that spine-chilling discovery, the rescue team still had to find the other 4 people. So, mentally prepared, they had to crawl past the bodies to move ahead. Almost at the end of Far Marathon, rescuers discovered 3 more bodies of Bill Frakes, Colin Vickers, and Dave Adamson. As soon as all the bodies were identified, the team returned to the surface. It was only after some time that it dawned on them. They were so overwhelmed with all that traumatizing experience that they had only found 5 bodies instead of 6. That meant that John Ogden was still somewhere there in the cave network. They still had to find him, but unfortunately, the dam they built was starting to break, raising the water levels again. So they had nothing else to do but wait until the following day. The chances of John being alive were next to non-existent, but as the rescuers didn't find his body near the other victims, they started to hope that he'd manage to get into a safe spot and survive. If he was alive, they needed to find him, and if not, they still needed to find his body. So the rescue team looked for him in the smaller tunnels of Marathon Crawl. When they finally found his body, they were horrified. John Ogden was squeezed into the crack that logically couldn't even fit a person inside. But probably, in desperation to get some air, he somehow got in there before dying. He was also really close to where the 3 other bodies were discovered. The rescuers concluded that it was probably hard to notice him the first time because of all the mud and debris after the flooding. Nobody could tell if the water was flooding the cave slowly or rushing extremely fast. Either way, it's still hard to imagine how those cavers tried to get some air while wriggling themselves into tight spaces as they were filling up with water. They were probably trying to reach higher levels named mud caves, but unfortunately, they weren't fast enough. It was hard to decide what to do with their bodies. Experts said that getting them up to the surface was impossible, so they were left on site. The cave was sealed, and the only safe entrance was covered with concrete. For 3 more years, it stayed that way, with the water constantly flooding the caves with bodies inside. That was until another rescue team finally reopened the cave in 1971. They had an exhausting and gruesome mission at hand. The families of the 6 victims agreed to have their bodies retrieved from the Marathon tunnels and bury them in higher levels of the cave system. Afterward, the entrance was closed forever with a memorial plaque attached just above it. The landowner had prohibited entering the Mossdale Caverns. However, it still didn't stop some reckless cavers. Despite its fearsome reputation, they've found other ways to get into the cave system and have been exploring all the underground tunnels and passages. Many are afraid of this cave network as it's prone to complete flooding, while others believe that there's something supernatural there as well. With 6 dead people inside, most consider the caverns haunted. Some even swear that they could hear distant voices when they went down. Actually, there's even a video with those weird noises recorded. Here, listen carefully. Can you hear anything?
I think I can hear people.
Don't get scared that quickly. Honestly, it might be just the cave sounds. The acoustics there are quite good, combined with endless splashing everywhere, so we get those ghost-like noises. Most adequate people who have never tried caving can also wonder why people even go on such dangerous adventures. Why did those 6 people enter the caverns that day? And what drives those amateurs to go back again and again, despite this horrifying incident? I guess the answer is different for everyone. Some want to be the first to visit an untouched and undiscovered land, while others seek adventures or good exercise for their bodies. I hope this story opened your eyes and helped you understand how deadly caving can be. Just imagine one accident and so many victims who met a truly terrible end. Nonetheless, thank you for watching the video. Give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed it and want more similar content. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next, even more breathtaking episode.